Moss poles are a popular way to support and maximize the growth of indoor plants, but there are some drawbacks to consider. In this video, I'm going to discuss some disadvantages of using moss poles for your indoor plants. The first issue is cost. Moss poles can be expensive, and this is something that is conveniently glazed over when we're encouraging use of moss poles. It is even more expensive if you're buying pre-made moss poles or you're buying pre-made moss pole kits. You can make your own moss poles. It's invariably cheaper to make your own moss poles, but that doesn't mean it's cheap. The cost of the wire mesh, the cost of the plastic sheet back, everything adds up, and invariably it can be a very costly exercise, especially if you have as many plants as I do. Moss poles can be difficult for some people to install. Some people find them quite fiddly. They find it quite difficult to attach the plant to the moss pole, get the moss pole to stand up straight and look exactly the way they want it to look. It's not for the faint-hearted, and it can be a little bit finicky. It does get a lot easier the more you do it, but that's not to say it can't be a bit difficult at the start. Let's be honest, moss poles require frequent upkeep. They dry off pretty quickly, and you have to make sure you're on top of keeping the moss pole moist, because if you're not keeping the moss pole moist, then what was the point of using the moss pole in the first place? You could have just as well used a plank or a trellis. The whole point of keeping your plant on a moss pole is to keep the moss moist so that the plant is taking advantage of the nutrient solution that you've got trapped in your moss pole. It's anchoring onto the moss and it's climbing and getting bigger. So you need to keep the moss moist, and that takes a lot of upkeep, especially summertime when it's really hot and those moss poles are just getting dry every 2 days. It can be rather annoying. I'm just saying, especially if you have a lot of moss poles. Another thing that you need to do with moss poles is make sure that the nodes of the plant are really close to the moss pole. This is what I mean. I've got my Monstera adansonii, I've got my nodes here. I want to make sure that this plant is as close to the moss pole as possible and not growing away from it so that it can start to attach. The closer your node is to the moss pole, the more likely it is for the area roots to grow out and attach to the moss pole and let the moss pole do what it needs to do. That means you're constantly monitoring your plant to see if there are new nodes that have formed. You're making sure that you've got your Velcro plant tie or your greening pins or a U-shaped piece of wire that you're going to use to make sure that that plant is closely opposed to the moss pole. Moss poles can get algae. Moss poles getting algae is one of the things that a lot of people complain about a lot. And if you don't like the look of a moss pole getting algae, it can be quite off-putting. In and of itself, the algae on your moss pole is not harmful to the plant. But if there's a lot of algae on your moss pole, it does start to become a little bit icky. And if that algae has gone all the way through and has gone straight through your moss, then invariably it's going to start competing with your plant. Not ideal. Having said that, having algae on your moss pole, for me anyway, is a sign that I'm doing the right thing. It's a sign that I'm keeping my moss pole moist. It's a sign that my plant is receiving a lot of light, because nutrition, water, and light, the things that a plant needs to survive, are the things that algae needs to bloom. So if you're doing all those things and your moss pole is getting algae, well done you. But what can you do to get rid of the algae? A simple way of getting rid of the algae is just getting a high pressure spray and just spraying that algae off your moss pole. And it doesn't need to be, a Karcher high pressure sprayer. You can just get your hose, put it on the high, on the jet spray, and that will work just fine. Some people have said that you can use 3% hydrogen peroxide. I don't know. I've never tried this before, so I can't vouch for it, but that's something you can do if you're really upset about the look of algae on your moss pole. Moss poles can develop mold, and I'm not talking about algae. I'm talking about actual icky, disgusting mold. And thankfully, this hasn't happened to me, touch wood, but I know a lot of people have complained that their moss poles develop mold. I reckon maybe it's because of the quality of the sphagnum moss that they're using. Maybe there isn't enough aeration or ventilation in their homes, because then that allows the mold to take a hold and actually germinate. I really don't know. It's just weird. What would I do if I got mold in my moss pole? I would completely get rid of that moss pole, just chuck it out because I couldn't deal. I don't know. If you have any ideas, anyone who's had experience with mold in moss poles, please let us know what it was that you did. I'm really, really interested to know. Moss poles do have limited use because they are obviously meant for climbing plants. So you can't use them for a plant that doesn't climb. You can't use them for a plant that doesn't get area roots. So if your plant doesn't do any of those things, your moss pole is useless. So you're better off getting something like a trellis, a bamboo trellis, a metal trellis, stuff like that. That's probably what you'd end up using, and that would work better for your plant. If you're finding value from this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Seriously though, there is great potential for damage to your plants when you use a moss pole. And this is something that I have personal experience with because the moss pole does get pretty heavy depending on the size of the moss pole, the size of your plants, and depending on how you've anchored the moss pole, it might go toppling over. It might go falling down. And when that happens, that moss pole is taking everything in its sight along with it. So if you've got a whole group of plants next together, everything is going down. And you know what that means? Damage to your beautiful leaves. And it's, oh my gosh, terrible, absolutely terrible. So yeah, you really need to be careful about how you put up your moss poles, especially as they start to get bigger and taller. Then they're more likely to topple over. And you know, if you've got small children, pets, I'd be very careful about where I place my moss poles. Some people just don't like the aesthetics of a moss pole. They don't like how it looks. They think it's unsightly, which is fine. You know, we're all entitled to our opinions. And if you think you don't like the look of a moss pole, then don't have one by all means. There's so many ways in which you can get your plants to climb up. It doesn't necessarily have to be a moss pole. Some people use iron bark. Some people use planks, some people use metal trellises. There's just so many ways that you can get your plants to climb, and you can still get that sense of a jungle climbing up without using a moss pole. There have been some reports of rotting stems. This is my Monstera aurea here. That's the stem of the plant. It's living on a moss pole. This moss pole is moist, and because you keep that moss pole moist, that stem is going to rot. So some people say. This hasn't happened to me at all, and I have had in excess of 50 moss poles, and I have not seen this happen. Maybe it's the environment that those plants are in. Maybe there isn't enough aeration around the plant. I really couldn't say, but having rotting stems is not something that's happened to me, but something to keep at the back of your mind because it has been reported. A happy problem that you might have is that your plant is going to outgrow the moss pole, because that means that your moss pole is working very well, your plant is happy, and your plant is growing. And at that point, you're going to be faced with the problem. This is my Syngonium batique living on its moss pole. This is a plastic sheetback moss pole, and this is the plant over there. Clearly outgrown its moss pole, and that stem is now just hanging over there. You can do two things. You can either extend the moss pole, you can keep extending, you can put another moss pole, but eventually you're going to hit the ceiling. That's eventually what's going to happen. We're growing our plants indoors. We have a ceiling. We can't just keep going. What do you do then? What do you do then? You will have no option but to chop your plant. Nothing else for it. You're either taking it outside to grow all the way up to the heavens, like Jack's beanstalk, or you're going to have to chop it. I had my Epipremnum aureum golden ivy that went all the way to the ceiling, and I had no choice, but I had to chop it. I've chopped up a few other plants as well because they've just gotten all the way to the top and there's nothing else to do. So bearing in mind that when you get a moss pole, you are signing up to make these decisions. You're either going to have to chop or you're going to have to extend. Think about what it is that you want to do, or whether it's something you want to do in the first place. The next issue is sphagnum moss actually does degrade. Did you know that? It is an organic product. It does degrade. And of course, that entirely depends on the quality of the sphagnum moss that you're dealing with. Generally, New Zealand sphagnum moss is thought to be the gold standard of sphagnum moss. It's like the best quality sphagnum moss there is. So if you're using New Zealand sphagnum moss, then you know your sphagnum moss is going to last a lot longer, not degrade as quickly as the other sphagnum mosses from other places. And sphagnum moss can generally last from about 2 to 5 years. So your moss pole is not going to last forever. It is going to degrade. So the amount of moss in that pole is just going to get thinner and thinner, smaller and smaller, and then it's, I don't know, probably going to, I don't know what happens, because I've never had a moss pole degrade like that. I've never noticed. And I guess the reason I don't is because the plant grows and eventually you'll either need to chop it or do something. So you're invariably doing something and you're putting a new moss pole, something, whatever. So I have no idea what a moss pole that's degraded looks like. But that's something to think about. It's not going to last forever. So if you're not going to be extending it and thinking you're just going to keep chopping and chopping and chopping and your plant's going to live forever on that moss pole, it's not. Know that it's not. The final point is sphagnum moss itself. And I know some of you will have been waiting for this one because there's no way I could have skirted around it. It's a very important issue and very, very pertinent to talk about. We're talking about moss poles here, not a pole that has got other media inside it. A moss pole is a pole that's got sphagnum moss in it. Now, there are some environmental issues about the harvesting of sphagnum moss, and sometimes there is a little bit of confusion between sphagnum moss and peat moss. So sphagnum moss and peat are two very different things. Peat is a product of years, many decades of a degradation of sphagnum moss and other products in a specific area in nature, in a bog. And in order for that peat to be harvested, they drain the bogs, they basically decimate the ecosystem to get this peat. That's not what sphagnum moss is. Sphagnum moss is what lives at the top and it's alive, and they just go there and they harvest it. But that can also be harmful depending on how the sphagnum moss is harvested. So people who ethically harvest sphagnum moss, or who do it in the right way, will say how their sphagnum moss is harvested, where it's farmed, where it's from. So for those of us who insist on using sphagnum moss, we really are beholden to find out exactly what kind of moss we're using, how it's been harvested, and where it's been harvested from, if we want to do our bit for the environment. That's the thing we need to do. So it's not necessarily in my mind that using sphagnum moss is bad, but find out where your sphagnum moss is from, how it's harvested, and how you can get sphagnum moss that is not harvested in a way that's damaging to the environment. Comments down below. I'd love to know. I know this has been a bit of a weird video coming from someone who has in excess of 40 moss poles. I love a moss pole. If a plant climbs, I will put it on a moss pole because that's what works for me, works for my plants. So I love to do it, but I would not force my opinions on anybody else. All I can do is provide you with information, and hopefully you can make that decision for yourself. Look at the pros and cons, see what works in your space, see what works for your plants, see what works for your conscience, and make that decision an informed decision. And if you have decided that using moss poles is the way you'd like to want to go, check out this video where I show how to make a simple moss pole in just a few simple steps. I'll see you there.